IISS DC. I'm Stephen Simon, Executive Director here, and also in Manama. When you should visit our office there, which is quite a bit more lavish than this, if you fancy lavish. Today's subject is spillover. As you know, we have a great panel to address that question. I'm going to keep my palaver to an absolute minimum because we've only got an hour. We've got 4 speakers, and they've all got something substantial to say, so I'm going to do some very brief introductions and then start it off, and I'll get to the order in which we'll do this in just a second after the introductions. To my immediate left is Professor Henri Barkey. Many of you know him. He's been around Washington for quite a long time. He's a professor at Lehigh University. He has worked on the Secretary's policy planning staff at the Department of State, and he's recently co-edited a book with Phoebe Marr, a renowned Iraq expert whose name, again, many of you may know, and Scott Lesensky, who's now at the U.S. Department of State, on Iraq and its neighbors, and he's written something rather more, a bit more recently in December of 2012 called Spin-Off, the Syrian Crisis and the Future of Iraq, and you can find that in the American Interest. To his left, we have Ambassador James Jeffrey. He's the Philip Solon's Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Washington Institute. He's not only a distinguished visiting fellow, he's also a distinguished diplomat who served as U.S. Ambassador to Turkey from 2008 to 2010 and U.S. Ambassador to Iraq from 2010 to 2012. In the George Bush administration, he was Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor. Before that, at the State Department, he was the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for NEA, the Near Eastern Affairs Bureau. Earlier appointments included service as Senior Advisor on Iraq to the Secretary of State, the Chargé and Deputy Chief of Mission in Baghdad, and the Deputy Chief of Mission in Ankara. And what I didn't know was that you were Ambassador to Albania. You have come a long way, sir.
I'd get better than Albania.
Now you're in Albania on the Potomac. To Ambassador Jeffrey's left is Kim Ghattas. She is a BBC State Department radio and TV correspondent. She's been doing that since 2008, and she travels regularly with the Secretary of State. I don't know how they squeeze you on the airplane, but she is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, The Secretary, A Journey with Hillary Clinton from Beirut to the Heart of American Power. And I'm eager to find out where that actually is, where that's located. She's produced several documentaries about Hillary Clinton, as well as Lebanon, and her latest documentary for BBC World Service Radio, which airs on February 20th, addresses the impact of the war in Syria on Lebanon. I just read something that was on the web, wasn't it? Yes. Yeah. It's a very good piece which you can find on your nearest worldwide web. Before this, she was Middle East correspondent for the BBC and the FT, and she was based in Beirut. At the end of the table is IISS Consulting Fellow for Middle Eastern Studies, Ben Fishman. He served for 4 years on the NSC staff at the White House until September of 2013. Most recently as Director for North Africa and Jordan, and in that capacity he helped manage the President's visit to Jordan in March of 2013. What I'd like to do is begin with Ambassador Jeffrey, then go to Henri Barkey, then to Kim, and then to Ben. I would ask the speakers to keep it to 5 to 7 minutes apiece so that we've got a full 30 minutes for Q&A. We'll be running a little over, but let's, if we can, keep it to 5 to 7 minutes. Jim.
Okay, I'll talk fast. Is this thing on?
Yeah.
Folks have been gathering in places like this in Washington, London, and elsewhere for many, many decades talking about the latest crisis in the Middle East. What's different now, today? Two major region-wide developments, and they both come together in Syria and thus in the region around it. One, the Arab Spring and the shaking of the established dysfunctionalities of the region into unknown, unpredictable dysfunctionalities. Secondly, at least the perception of American withdrawal and growing disinterest from and growing disinterest in the region and the impact that that has. Syria sees both. A lack of American engagement just a year or so after we engaged very significantly in Libya at the tail end of many engagements in the region, and the engagement of a new set of actors, Russia, Hezbollah, Iran, and the rump Assad government, that are slowly clawing their way to something that's going to look like a Chechnya victory if we're not careful. Meanwhile, to the extent they don't achieve a full victory, rather like Chechnya, what's left of the place is going to be in the hands of a particularly wild and brutal, and that's saying a lot, variant of Al-Qaeda, a gang so bad that Al-Qaeda Central has disowned them. This is of extraordinary significance to the entire region, to American foreign policy, and to global stability. And thus, it's only in the context of that that we can look at its impact on specific issues: chemical weapons control, refugees, human rights violations, terrorism, and specific countries. In the case of, however few minutes I have left, Iraq. Boy, is Iraq impacted by this. Iraq, I've argued, and I think the record largely will show, was an imperfect success of a decade of American involvement. You have an institutional democracy there that is full of problems, but most other countries at that stage of development in a democratic direction have similar problems. You had major splits between religious and sectarian groups, namely the Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs, and the Kurds in the north. And you had pulling and tugging from most of the region's neighbors of the country because it was weak and vulnerable. Nonetheless, it was sort of a going concern until Syria blew up. And that has put great strains in three ways on Iraq. First of all, to the extent that Syria is a microcosm of, or a precursor to, a regional Sunni-Shia split, Iraq is going to get torn asunder, like no other country in the region except for Lebanon, Bahrain, and perhaps a little bit Kuwait. The country lies on a religious fault line. And this is extremely frightening to all Iraqis, because Iraqis also have a tradition of non-sectarian living together. There are two competing trends. This accentuates the trend towards sectarian struggle in a very, very negative way. Secondly, the Kurds find themselves in an awkward position in a triangular relationship with Turkey and the Syrian Kurds, who have adopted a somewhat unique position in the struggle in Syria, trying to carve out an autonomous area, sometimes fighting the al-Nusra and ISIL people, sometimes working with at least parts of the insurgency. It's very hard to figure out that relationship. Also, their relationship with both Turkey and the Kurds, but that's another stress factor. And that is being accentuated by a flow of refugees from Syria, from the Kurdish areas into Kurdistan, and on the margins, and you have to look at this carefully, but in looking at the press and talking to people, you see it, some movement of Kurdish Sunni jihadists back into Kurdistan, which is a threat to Erbil. And then finally, in the Sunni areas, you have the emergence of a new AQI, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which calls itself Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, that is operating in almost battalion-level strength with heavy weapons and highly trained, experienced fighters in Anbar province. They've seized Fallujah, and they're operating now as far north as Mosul and into Baghdad, so far just with suicide bombers. But this is having a tremendous impact both on the Sunni population and on the sectarian split. So far there has not been a degeneration into the widespread ethnic population-on-population violence we saw in 2007, 2006, but that's danger number one. Danger number two is that these various factors, in some way that even the people, the Iraqis, who are working this every day, and their friends in the United States and elsewhere, can't predict, will split the place apart. It's not a certainty, it may not even be a probability, but it is one of the more dangerous things facing us in this region, because Iraq is not just any Arab state or any state in the Middle East. It is in the very center, from a standpoint of oil and gas, probably number two to Saudi Arabia, and potential exports to the region by 2020. It is a major international and global player, and it is at risk. Stop there.
Okay, I've been asked to look at the spillover impact of the Syrian crisis on Turkey. Essentially, there are four sets of, that I can think of, but there may be more that I haven't thought about, but sets of spillover effects. And they're very essentially quite simple. The first one is the jihadist threat. I mean, the jihadist threat in the sense that you have now all these, as you heard, from Jim, that you have all these Al-Qaeda types, Al-Nusra types, who have been running around northern Iraq, northern Syria and the rest of Syria, and a lot of them, as we know, have essentially come through Turkey. I mean, there are all these stories of people flying down to southern Turkey and sitting next to some kind of jihadists coming from England or somewhere else. I've tried to sit next to some of them when I fly to Turkey, but I haven't had that success yet, that chance. But the point is that you have these jihadists coming in, you have some Turkish jihadists also joining the struggle in Syria. So the most obvious, and the thing that most European countries also face, is that these guys will ultimately come back to, because they transit from Turkey, they may engage in violent activities in Turkey. And the problem is that the Turks don't have essentially a very good solution. Nobody has a good solution to this, because you can try to squash them as much as you can, but then you risk getting them, shall we say, upset and react against you. The other option is to co-opt them, and the Turks have tried to do that. In fact, they've tried too much of that, but I don't think that you can co-opt essentially jihadist elements. I mean, these are not exactly run-of-the-mill opponents whom you can trust down the road to essentially remember a deal they made with you. Now, there is no necessarily reason for these jihadists to essentially target Turkish targets, but they can get involved in the refugee camps. And remember, there's at least 600,000 refugees, probably more, in Turkey, Syrian refugees. Some of them are Alawites, and most of them obviously are Sunnis, but there are clearly divisions among the Sunnis, as we see in Syria, that also cross that border. So the jihadist threat is essentially the first. The second spillover impact has to do with the Turkish domestic politics, and that's the Sunni-Alevi divide. Now, remember, the Alevis in Turkey are not Alawites. There is an Alawite component in Turkey. These are people who essentially came from Alexandretta, when Alexandretta was taken over from Turkey. These are relatives of the people who live in Syria. But there's about 15% of the population which is Alevi, which is different than the Nusayris, as the Turks call the Alawites of Syria. Traditionally, these people have been leftists. They tend to vote for the secular parties. They tend to be very anti the AKP, and the AKP itself has had a policy, essentially a very Sunni policy at home, as well as a Sunni policy abroad. Some, Maliki and others in Iraq will argue that the Turkish foreign policy has been mostly Sunni. But that divide, that Sunnism or Sunni policy on the part of the Turkish government is having repercussions at home, in the sense that you have a great deal of opposition from these groups in Turkey. But the real problem here is that the government itself, and Erdogan in particular, has exacerbated the situation. There was a bomb attack in the city of Reyhanlı near the border with Syria where 52 Turks died. And Erdogan got up and said the next day that 52 of his Sunni citizens had been killed by presumably Alevi or Alawite bombs. So clearly, I mean, this is the first time I remember, you can remember in Turkish history where you have somebody as senior as a prime minister making such an inflammatory speech and and kind of dividing the Turkish population between Sunnis and Alevis. I mean, you've heard of Kurds versus Turks before, but nobody has ever used the citizenship descriptions in this way. So you have essentially, from that perspective, a blowback, and clearly in fact, by the way, there's also an Alevi group people who escaped Turkey in the 1980s who went to Syria, leftists, extreme leftists, who are actually suspected of having committed this atrocity in Reyhanlı. So you do have an open border, you have all kinds of violence that can come that way. Again, domestically, another spillover, and that has to do essentially a spillover that is from the Syria crisis, but it is also the government's policies. And to a great extent, you're getting the impression that the Turkish government is allowing Sunni, very Sunni groups like the IISS, who is most known to American public. They are the guys who organize the Mavi Marmara trip to Israel, to Gaza, that ended up in that disaster. But the IISS is a very aggressive, very Sunni, and also I don't get the sense that it does always necessarily do what the government is doing. And the government has allowed IISS to run amok in the southeast. And these guys may also turn against the government one day, or may turn against another government if this Turkish government is going to change. I don't think it's going to change anytime soon, but the possibility. Kurds, Syrian Kurds. The Syrian Kurds were, we always talked about the Iraqi Kurds, the Turkish Kurds, maybe even the Iranian Kurds. The Syrian Kurds were always very, very dormant, and suddenly now you have a Syrian Kurdish problem. Now, it is also true that the PKK, under the radar, without maybe the agents, the CIA here and all these other people knew about it, but I think it came a little bit as a surprise. When the Syrian crisis started, the speed with which the PYD, this is the pro-PKK Syrian Kurdish organization, organized itself, started to fight, and you realize that the PKK had been for years been preparing these guys for such an eventuality. So you do have a hardcore cadre of. The problem with the Syrian Kurds is not a security threat for the Turks. It is a political threat. The Turkish-Syrian border is essentially, it's not like the Iraqi border where you can cross it without people realizing. The Syrian Kurds are not powerful enough, but they do represent a political threat because it is another Kurdish population that is looking for autonomy, looking for recognition. But most importantly, it does, because it's affiliated to the PKK, it does strengthen the PKK and Öcalan's bargaining card as they negotiate now with the Turkish government. So there is a potential blowback, if you want, of the Syrian Kurdish development on the Turkish PKK, Turkish Kurd peace negotiation. I don't want to go into great detail, question and answer. Number four, my and fourth point in terms of the blowbacks is what I call the reputation destruction. Now remember that Syria was the one country that the Turks made an example of their zero problems with their neighbors policy, which now of course is many problems with all the neighbors policy. But it was really the test case. It was the two countries essentially. Prime Minister Erdogan and President Bashar Assad, traveled, vacation together. They had joint cabinet meetings. I mean, you'd think almost there was an integration between the two countries. And suddenly, Erdogan flips over Assad, and this is not necessarily a criticism of this, but of his policy choices. I mean, he, just like Erdogan, just like us, essentially did not understand the durability of the Assad regime. I understand Maliki was very clear when the American ambassador told him that President Obama was going to say Assad has to go. Apparently, he said, "You don't understand the Assad regime." Turkey, and clearly we did not understand. But the point here is that the collapse of the relationship with Syria was also the beginning of the unraveling of Turkey's relationship with many of its neighbors, Iraq in particular. I don't think the relationship with Iran is in that battle, but that's not part of my talk now. The point here, however, is that from a point where the Turks, full of hubris, would say, we own the Arab Spring, nothing can happen in the Arab Spring without us deciding what is going to happen. And Davutoglu even said, not a leaf can move in the Middle East without us deciding that it should. So from that hubris, now the Turks have almost zilch in terms of influence. So that reputation destruction, if you want, is a result of the Syrian crisis. And just to conclude with one line, look, spillovers happen in all conflicts. And in some ways you can say it's situational, whether or not it becomes a real crisis. It really depends on crisis management. And I think when you look at this reputation destruction that I mentioned for Erdogan, it also comes at a time when he's facing a very, very severe domestic political crisis that he's fighting almost with his hands tied behind his back. He's going to kind of come on top, but the reputation destruction that occurred internationally is also happening domestically. So the Erdogan that we see today is a very initiated Erdogan compared to before. And all of these things come at a certain time. The Syrian crisis without the domestic crisis may not have been that damaging, but the two together is turning out to be quite severe for Erdogan. Thank you.
Thank you, Henri. Kim?
Thank you for having me. I think there's perhaps going to be a little bit of a competition between all of us here to decide which country is impacted most by the war in Syria. And I'd like to posit that it's actually Lebanon. It doesn't get as much attention as some of the other countries, perhaps. And when it does, it is often lumped in the same bag as Jordan, Turkey, and Iraq. And mostly it is discussed in the context of the refugee crisis and occasional spillover of the violence from Syria into Lebanon. I just spent a month in Lebanon, and as Steve indicated, I just put together a documentary about the impact of the war in Syria on Lebanon. And I found that really no other country in the Middle East lives with the impact of the war in Syria more than Lebanon. Citizens in Amman or Baghdad or Istanbul don't wake up in the morning like people do in Beirut, wondering what their future is going to look like depending on whether Assad loses or the rebels become victorious. And it's important to understand why that is because of the history, the combined history, the shared history between the two countries, whether people like it or not in Lebanon, whether they're allied to the Assad government or were in the past. That history, that shared history, is the reason why Lebanon lives with the day-to-day ups and downs of the war across the border. In my travels around the country, I went from the Bekaa to Tripoli to Hezbollah areas in the southern suburbs of Beirut to the more posh areas of downtown Beirut. I found that there was a real deep sense of despair about the future. There's a real sense of lack of control over the circumstances. The Lebanese have been through their own wars in the past. They've lived through years of very shaky peace. But there was always a sense that at least they held some of the keys to reconciliation if they wanted to reconcile, even if they often also feel like pawns in a greater game. But at the moment, they're really not in control. And your average citizen in Lebanon very much feels like they're living a war that is not their own. Now, of course, you also have several factions in Lebanon that are deeply involved in the war across the border. Because again, going back to the history between Lebanon and Syria, 30 years of occupation of Lebanon, every faction, every political party in Lebanon feels that it has a stake in what is going on in Syria. So you have the Sunni militants in the north, or in places like Sidon in the south, who have allied themselves with the rebels, some of them fighting even with the rebels in Syria. And you have, of course, the role of Hezbollah. And all of that means that the war in Syria is also partly being fought in Lebanon. So beyond the refugee crisis, we have 1 million refugees almost in Lebanon. It's a very small country of 4 million people, which means that 1 in 4 people in Lebanon at the moment are Syrian refugees. Beyond that refugee crisis, there is also the security issue and the instability. Over the last 2 or 3 years, since 2011, we've seen 16 car bombs, 129 people killed, and some of it is retaliation for what is happening actually in Syria. So Lebanon acts like a bit of a pressure valve as well for the fighting across the border. I detected 3 trends when I was in Lebanon reporting for this documentary. The growth, obviously, of Sunni militancy. There is a real sense that there's a lot at stake for Sunnis in what happens in Syria. That's why you see fighters, and I spoke to some of them, go across the border, fight with the rebels, with various brigades, the more moderate or the more radical ones. Lebanese Sunnis have historically avoided Islamist militancy. They're more into trade and business, but they feel like their back is against the wall at the moment. And that is a trend that is not too worrisome at the moment, but could degenerate and continue to grow worse if the war across the border continues. The other phase, of course, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions about that, the other trend is, of course, a new phase in Hezbollah's existence in Lebanon. After having been the resistance against Israel, their arch enemy, for so many years, they're now very much involved in the fighting in Syria, trying to shore up the forces of President Bashar al-Assad. And it is creating tensions within Lebanon and within the Shia community, for sure. It's very difficult to get Shias to tell you that, certainly not on the record. I couldn't get anyone in my interviews to express that discontent, but it is there. Interestingly, though, the more civilian areas get targeted by car bombs that are claimed by radical Sunni groups, the more you will paradoxically find that the Shia community will again rally around Hezbollah, because they will see that Hezbollah is their only protection against the rise of those radical groups. The last trend that I found, which is, in my efforts always to find a silver lining in my reporting, wherever there is doom and gloom, in my interviews with everybody around Lebanon, I found one sentence kept coming back, and that was, at the end of the day, we all have to live together, Sunnis, Shias, and Christian. And I was quite surprised to hear that, and it was a statement that came to me unprompted. I did not actually ask the question. It was a conclusion that every single speaker gave me. I was in Lebanon as a reporter up until the year 2007, when the situation was very tense as well for other reasons. There's always tension in Lebanon. And at that time, there was very much a sense within the different communities that they had to push back against the others and try to, in essence, annul their existence, from the Arabic word ilgha. Everybody wanted to cancel the other side. Fast forward to today, there is a deep realization that that is simply not an option. And all the talk and all the headlines about a possible civil war erupting in Lebanon, I found, is exaggerated, because when you talk to your average person in Lebanon, they have come to the conclusion, they have learned the hard lesson, that going back to the civil war is simply not an option. That is not the solution. And if anybody had any illusions that it could serve their interest or the interest of Lebanon or their community, looking across the border at what the civil war is doing to Syria has been a very painful reminder of what it could mean for Lebanon should it slide down that road again. That is not to say that we will definitely avoid that scenario. The longer the war continues in Syria, the harder it will be for the Lebanese to withstand the shock. How do we move forward? It's very difficult to see how, beyond just trying to avoid a slide into widespread chaos, how you actually move forward. I think the the formation of a government over the weekend was a good sign. It's a temporary compromise. It'll be a short-lived government. It will only last for about 3 months or so until the presidential election, probably, which takes place in May. But it was a welcome sign that the different communities are starting to work together to compromise after having been without a cabinet for 11 months. That was the only sign that all sides are starting to compromise, and particularly, and I'll end here, it was a sign that Hezbollah is feeling the heat from the role that it's playing across the border in Syria, because it agreed to give up several key ministries in this cabinet after having tried to resist doing so for so long.
Thanks.
I won't try to compete with Kim about whether Jordan or Lebanon is suffering more as a result of Syria. But I would posit that I think of all the 4 countries, Jordan certainly depends most on international assistance to weather the storm of the Syria refugee crisis, predominantly, and the other spillover effects that it has. That support starts first and foremost here in Washington, or Sunnylands, California, which was the case with the King Abdullah's meeting with the president last weekend. And I think that exemplifies the relationship between the Obama administration and the Hashemite Kingdom in this period of political turmoil in the rest of the region. As Steve mentioned, I worked on the president's visit to Jordan last year, and it's, I think, pretty notable that of all the 4 countries since the Arab Spring, I think, has erupted, that we're talking about today, the president has only visited Jordan, and that suggests that the closeness of the relationship there. And in terms of Sunnylands, the last head of state visit in this sort of desert oasis town or villa in California was President Xi of China, which puts King Abdullah on par with a global superpower in some ways. Just quote briefly from what the president said during that visit, I think it's fair to say that we have very few friends, partners, and allies around the world that have been as steadfast and reliable as His Majesty King Abdullah. And I don't think the White House gives those compliments out for free or disingenuously. So why is Jordan so important to the Obama administration? There are a number of reasons in terms of the closeness of the military and security cooperation, first and foremost. But I think, going back to what Ambassador Jeffrey said, to start the discussion, in a period of so much uncertainty and turmoil in the region, Jordan has been this steadfast ally and the most reliable, I think, of all of the countries, not just of the ones we're talking about today, but across the region, in terms of dependability and in supporting American objectives in the broader region, whether it's on the peace process, whether it's on normalizing Iraq's relationships with its neighbors, whether it's on Syria. And that's reflected both in the security relationship, in foreign policy issues, certainly in Jordan's support for the Kerry peace process effort, and it's, I think, represented by Jordan's recent assumption of the role, the traditional Arab role on the UN Security Council. And in return, Jordan doesn't ask for a whole lot by comparable standards. It certainly relies on substantial economic assistance, and the King makes a number of requests annually that are predictable, but these fall well within the bounds of reason for what we get in return out of this relationship. So that's the basis, I think, for this degree of closeness exhibited by the president. For a country of just over 6 million people to absorb over 1 million Syrian refugees is pretty astounding, and it would be a challenge for Jordan under any circumstances. But during its a period of broader economic challenges, it's almost impossible. But it manages, and it manages for a variety of reasons. You know, it's important to recognize that these people envision the refugee problem in Jordan as being limited to this massive Zatri refugee camp that has been well covered in the press. But Zatri at any given time hosts only about 100,000 refugees. That leaves nearly 1 million to be absorbed in the broader communities in Jordan. And in a small country, it's a pretty daunting challenge. They're living among the broader population, and they're dependent on government services and education and health. And so the reason that I think Jordan manages is because, unlike Lebanon, for example, it does have a cohesive state apparatus, and it is responsive to the central government of Oman. It may not be the most efficient government, and it may not be the most effective government, but it's a government nonetheless, and it's in great interest of the United States and the rest of the world to keep it that way. So, beyond Washington, the assistance that Jordan relies on is quite astounding. We provide over $1 billion of annual assistance a year to Jordan. The King announced in Sunnylands that the 5-year annual commitment of $660 million in economic and military assistance would be renewed. We have $1 billion in loan guarantees that was announced last year, $1 billion more this year. It's an astounding amount for a small economy. On top of that, Jordan relies on the IMF, and this $2 billion, sorry, a $2 billion loan agreement, and is making a number of economic reforms along those lines. I'll pause there to regain my breath here for a second.
I think that the impact on Jordan that you described, with the international support that the U.S. gives to Jordan, is a key point, Steve, if you'll allow me to interject, because it is important to remember that small countries like Jordan, but also Lebanon, do need international support. And I would argue that the Lebanese are very jealous of the Jordanians because they do get a lot of aid from Washington, because it's easier to deal with a country like Jordan, which is very firmly in the camp of ally of the United States. It's a lot more difficult for a country like Lebanon to ask for that kind of money, even though we would love to get a summit in Sunnylands, and we would love to get $1 billion from the US, but the politics of Lebanon are much more complicated. They're much more complicated because of groups like Hezbollah, because of the presence of Sunni militants. But you had, Jordan had the summit in Sunnylands. We had one of the few meetings with President Obama during the UN General Assembly. So there we go again with the regional competition.
Let me just make two concluding points. The economic and political crisis that is facing Jordan as a result of the Syria challenges doesn't make the political challenges that the king faces domestically, regardless of Syria, any less. he's it's almost as if it's a blessing in disguise for him at the moment, because nobody's sort of the formal opposition has been quashed by a number of factors, particularly the most dominant group, the Muslim Brotherhood, has been stymied by what's going on in Egypt, but also the broader concern of the general public that why should we raise the specter of political change in Jordan now, when we see on our border what's so devastating, what the devastating prospects could be. But that doesn't mean that these problems about the population's complaints about Hashemite governance have disappeared altogether, and the underlying conditions of those criticisms still exist about corruption, about broader legitimacy, about effectiveness. And so the point I wanted to make is that the king really has a moment right now to address these challenges, but he's not really doing that. And he's taken a pause since the successful parliamentary election in January 2013 to really to not to take on the reform agenda that he laid out in a series of discussion papers from 2012 to the middle of 2013. And so domestically, he can continue to sort of focus on Syria and the effects of Syria, but unless he views cleaning up the situation at home or addressing the situation at home as part of that broader challenge, then I think Jordan is in for a longer challenge overall. The last point, I think, is just that Jordan is succeeding for the reasons that or muddling along for the reasons I laid out before in terms of the significant international assistance it's receiving. But that sort of assumes the status quo will continue. And maybe it can absorb 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 more refugees. But what happens if there are 500,000 more? Or what happens if there are 1 million more driven by some escalation in the fighting in the south? Or if you read, if you believe what's in the press right now about considering additional or more aggressive options from the United States to either intervene militarily or through other means in Syria, Jordan will be on the front lines of any of that activity. Likely, if there's some kind of consideration of humanitarian corridor or anything like that, implementing those will involve U.S. troops or something in Jordan, and the prospect of the status quo in those circumstances in Jordan just sort of continuing as if the Syria crisis isn't impacting day-to-day life would be much harder in those circumstances.
Thanks, Ben. We've got 45 minutes till the end of the session, which gives us a good amount of time for Q&A, but I wanted to carve out 10 or 15 minutes towards the end for the panelists to wrap up loose ends, deal with some themes that they don't think were really dealt with in the Q&A. I've got questions myself that I'd like to pose towards the end, so let's say about 30 minutes, 35 minutes for Q&A. If you've got a question, please identify yourself. Before you speak, we've got a mic coming around for those who wish to ask questions. So let's kick it off. Sir.
Ken Meyercourt, World Docs. There was an interesting event a few weeks ago that I only know the bare details of, and hopefully Ms. Ghattas could fill in. I think it's maybe instructive of the spillover effect in Lebanon. A Saudi was arrested a few weeks ago, charged with some of the bombings in Lebanon. I think he was head of the El Qassam brigades or something like that. A few days after he was arrested, Saudi Arabia offered to provide $3 billion in aid to the Lebanese military. I don't know whether that was a bribe to release the Saudi or not. And then a few days after that, he died in custody. I don't know whether there's speculation whether he died or was killed. Anyway, I would be interested in what you know about the story.
Yes, I was in Beirut actually, and I didn't realize that I was staying with friends whose apartment is just across the street from the hospital where this man was being held. If I'd known, I would have understood why there was so much military deployed on the street, and maybe I would not have spent the night there. Majid was, yes, he's from the I keep forgetting the actual name of the group. Yes, the Abdullah al-Azzam brigades, of course. He, key figure, was a big nab for the Lebanese army. He was in Lebanon for dialysis, and he was therefore transferred to the military hospital to continue treatment. There was a lot of speculation at the time whether he was so ill that it was inevitable that he was going to die, or whether perhaps a soldier standing next to him by mistake flipped the switch and said, "Oh, sorry, we just ran out of power, dialysis can't continue." It's very difficult to get to the bottom of these things. But you're right that indeed, within a few days as well, I think it was a coincidence, the Saudi king announced that he was giving the Lebanese army $3 billion as a grant, a military grant. The deal is that the Lebanese army can buy weapons from the French, and the Saudis will foot the bill. That is quite a big grant for the Lebanese army, but it fits the greater image of, or the greater trend to try to bolster, in essence, the only national institution that remains respected in Lebanon. Whatever problems you may see within the Lebanese armed forces, whatever the discussion may be about how much Hezbollah has influence within the army or not, it is an institution that the international community does feel deserves to be supported and bolstered. So those $3 billion will go towards that. Now, there's also a very symbolic aspect to it, because I can't imagine that money is going to instantly start flowing or be dispersed, or that whatever the army need, they will get. And they're certainly not going to get big pieces of aircraft, for example, because of the proximity with Israel and the state of war between the two countries. What I did find interesting was that when the president announced the grant, he ended his speech on national television by saying, "Long live Lebanon, long live the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia," which not many people appreciated in Lebanon, despite their gratitude. If you are a supporter of the army, and if you are more aligned with Saudi and the West as opposed to Syria and Iran, not many people appreciated that gratitude should be expressed so openly to a Sunni kingdom, which many people in Lebanon also fought for, fanning the flames of sectarianism.
Thank you. Samir Sumedai, the former Iraqi ambassador to Washington. In the one common factor we see in all these surrounding countries to Syria is the expanded role of the jihadists and the terrorists, if you like. No one understands the complexity, certainly in Iraq, more than Ambassador Jeffrey. He's lived through it, he understands it, I think, thoroughly. But I was surprised when I heard him characterize the situation in Fallujah, for example, as a town now controlled by Al-Qaeda or its affiliates. Actually, that's not accurate. The point I'm making, and the question I'm asking, is this. It has served Al-Assad regime to characterize the struggle in Syria to be between his regime and the terrorists. It's like a binary choice. Equally, it has been convenient for the current government in Baghdad to characterize its problems as a confrontation between the democratic process and the terrorists. The situation is, as you know, Ambassador, much more complex. And for the record, the people in Fallujah are the ones who are in control, and their enemy number one, as they see it, and I'm in contact with people there almost on a daily basis, is the terrorists and Al-Qaeda. And they see the government is the lesser of the two evils. Now, don't you think that in this city, the perception of the struggle, whether in Syria or in Iraq, should be seen in a much more nuanced light than the struggle simply between the regime and the terrorists?
With one important exception, I couldn't agree with you more. It's very, very important that we not buy into this narrative that we see with Assad, certainly, and at times we see with Mr. Maliki that anybody who opposes their regimes, who happens to be a Sunni, is either allied with or a jihadist from an Al-Qaeda offshoot. This is exactly what Assad, with a lot of help from Russia, has tried to do repeatedly in Geneva. You see the negotiations, they say, no, we first have to talk about the terrorist threat, and that means they are stamping everybody as terrorists. So at the strategic level, I agree with you. At the tactical level, and I know you know people there, and I know you're from the region, I have to disagree. Fallujah is effectively in the hands of Al-Qaeda the way Fallujah was in the hands of Al-Qaeda when I was there in Fallujah in May of 2004. There were other people there who were armed groups. There were tribal people who were more pro-government, less pro-government, but effectively you do not have central government authority in Fallujah. You do have central government authority in Ramadi, a bit contested. You do not have it in Fallujah. My experience has been if they don't have it today, they will have it tomorrow because they are extremely experienced fighters. They're in much greater strength than they were in 2004, 2005, and they have heavy weapons. It's hard for the regular army to stand up against them, and I think that Maliki's dream of having tribal levies throw them out of Fallujah is a myth. I don't think that's going to happen. And you know, we looked at this in 2004. We went out and met with the Fallujah Brigade and those kind of things. And in the end, the Al-Qaeda people just gained and gained and gained more effective control of the city. And I don't see why that won't happen this time.
Thank you. Next question. And towards the back on the left, on my left.
Stanley Kober. One question that hasn't been addressed: what should the United States do now? There are these reports of an intelligence gathering, turnover in the leadership of the Saudi intelligence. What should the United States do? Should we supply aid to the moderates? Could we control that? Any other options?
Who would like to take that question?
Let me answer this real quickly.
Okay.
Go. No, I just haven't answered a question. You go.
Look, personally, I've been always opposed to an American military intervention in Syria. I think it has the lessons of Iraq should be sufficient for us to understand that we are incapable of doing it. However, that said, I also would say that one of what is happening now is that everybody's looking at the United States, maybe to a lesser extent to Russia, to somehow come up with a magical formula for Syria. I think as I said, I don't think we're capable of doing it. I don't think people should look at us. But maybe it's time for the regional countries, especially in light of the opening to Iran, for the regional countries to, this is a regional problem. This is not our problem in many ways. Yes, the United States is the 800-pound gorilla, but we are far away. We've already got burnt once or twice, depending on how you count. And this is a problem, as you can see from what we've said so far, and which has blowback effects on everybody, including Iran. The Iranians are not the winners in this. The Iranians are, you know, whether or not Assad survives or doesn't survive, Iran has already lost. the increasing amount of sectarian tension in the region is has the possibility of a huge, bigger conflagration. So it's up, it's up to the regional powers and the United States and the Russians, if they want to, they can support a process. But it's up. I think it's time for the others to step up on us.
Let's do Ben and Kim, and then
Yeah, I think the lessons of Iraq are very important to keep in mind, but I also think that not doing anything isn't an option for much longer, because there is a risk of overcorrection for the US. It doesn't necessarily have to involve direct military action, and I don't think anybody in Washington is talking about that. But what I do pick up from talking to various American officials at the White House or at the State Department is, as we've seen being reported, they're seriously looking again at all the options, and they're some of the old options that you looked at when you were there as well. I foresee that in the next 18 months there will be more active involvement by the US in trying to shape what is happening on the ground, whether it's by supporting the US and the Saudis and other regional allies like the Jordanians to train and equip the rebels on the ground more, whether it involves covert operations or forcibly pushing for humanitarian access into Syria that allows for some breathing room for not just the rebels but also the civilian population and the civilian opposition. It's difficult to say that we've reached a point that is just untenable, because we've reached that point so many times before that it sounds callous to say that we've reached that point now, when even the UN has stopped keeping track of how many people are dying in Syria. But there is a certain realization that the horror of the war in Syria simply cannot continue. And one of the things that puzzles me in my own coverage, in my observing coverage of others and the reactions around the world, is the lack of public outrage at what is happening in Syria. And I haven't quite been able to put my finger on why that is, but there simply isn't the kind of public outrage that is commensurate with the tragedy that we're seeing unfold in Syria. I'm not saying it will change the policy in Washington, but it's certainly worth looking at.
I'd like to say that there'd be some multilateral type military action to bloody Assad's nose, because short of any kind of coercive threat, it's hard to envision a negotiated solution anytime soon. But the same problems with that approach will continue to be debated if these new options or revised options are being debated right now, which is how much exposure to our forces and what's the end state, what's the goal, what's the objective. It's hard to sort of pinpoint some kind of limited strike in that way, and I think the president's overarching concern will be not getting drawn into, as it has been through the duration, is not getting drawn into an interminable Iraq-like military action in an Arab country. And so it's a real dilemma, and that's why these other options about humanitarian corridors and no-fly zones or whatever are not as easy as they sound on paper, because any kind of establishment of safe areas or whatever inside Syrian territory requires that same degree of suppression of all kinds of Assad's capabilities and the exertion of a lot of American force. And what happens if there's retaliation, and how do you limit escalation and limit involvement? So that's less of an answer than just pointing out all the problems. But if smarter people can figure out a way to come up with some kind of precise type of strike, so Assad doesn't feel like he has complete impunity to continue killing people, whether perhaps if it's on the basis of his lack of follow through on the chemical weapons deal, that may be part of an answer. And I'm also skeptical that a more robust training and equipping of the opposition can succeed because of the fragmentation and how do you differentiate between which groups and how do you limit the whether it's Bandar or Mohammed bin Nayef, it's still the same problem for providing surface to air missiles or to the opposition, and ultimately who's going to be using them and how are you going to be preventing them from going into the people's hands that you don't want to support.
Jim? Okay, well, I can kind of agree with Kim, but I'm going to take on my other two colleagues here. This is a hard question, and I've wrestled with it, and others have, and the Washington Institute's Policy Watch has a piece I did 2 weeks ago on this in more detail, but I'll try to summarize it. But first I have to take a step back. We all have to decide, the administration, the international community, all of you, all of us, whether this thing is serious enough for our interests and for the region, and then if the region is serious enough for us to get involved, because we're looking at not just a human tragedy, as I said, we're looking at a huge explosion of jihadist capabilities, strength on the one hand, and a creeping Chechnya-like victory by a group of forces in the center of the Middle East that is going to change the geostrategic dialogue of the Middle East for the first time dramatically since we got involved in the Yom Kippur War in 1973, to our negative. Now, you may have to debate this, I may have to debate this, but the administration doesn't have to debate this, at least if we believe their words. The President stood up in the UN General Assembly and listed 4 crucial reasons why America should be willing to use all means at its disposal, and that's clear language for our military force in the region. Support our allies. Well, 4 allies, or quasi-allies, are surrounding Syria. We didn't talk about Israel, but that's certainly a major issue. Secondly, the flow of oil. That actually does impact the Syrian thing because of Iraq and the crucial role that the International Energy Agency ascribes to Iraq in the next decade. 3, prevention of the spread of terrorism. Well, you definitely have that. And 4, the weapons of mass destruction. You got a baby version of that with the chemical weapons. The much bigger issue that is inexorably tied to Syria is the Iranian nuclear account. So all 4 of these things seem to be in play for the administration. Thus, I would think the administration does think it's important. And then the question is what to do about it. And boy, that's hard. But I've seen hard before. It was hard figuring out what to do about Russia coming into Afghanistan. It was sure as hell hard figuring out what to do in the Balkans. For 3 years, we watched the slaughter go on proportionally bigger than Syria and Bosnia. And then people acted. President Reagan in the 1980s in Afghanistan, and of course President Clinton, and aided by Dick Holbrooke and some other people in the Balkans. First of all, just as in the Balkans, there is no regional solution. I wish there was. These people are too weak, they're too divided. As we saw, even the pro-resistance forces were split along ideological lines, with Turkey and Qatar over here, the UAE and the Saudis, and a couple of others over there. That's not a solution. Secondly, a bit more training. There I agree with you. That isn't a solution either. But we have a phenomenon, and I have to take on the administration here, we have that both Ben and I have served in, we have a phenomenon here where anything other than kicking the can down the road rears up the spectra of Iraq or Afghanistan. I'm sorry, that's not the case. That comes when you put hundreds, and I've had 3 years there and another year in Vietnam, so I know this kind of genre of American blunder. It's when you put hundreds of thousands of troops in a country because you think you can transform that country from an enemy or quasi-enemy country to a friendly country. By this time, we should learn we can't. I'm not sure we've learned that lesson for the long run, but I'm sure as hell sure we have learned that lesson in the immediate future in the Middle East. On the other hand, we've got a whole series of lessons. Bosnia, Kosovo, Libya, Haiti, Grenada, Libya in 1968, Desert Fox against Saddam, of limited American strikes, limited American moves, limited American deployments to aircraft carriers off of Taiwan, where we have managed to succeed, at least tactically and at least temporarily, in achieving results without a new Iraq. We also have 2 other examples, Somalia and Beirut, 1983. What do those examples prove? When we do screw up and start getting on a slippery slope, to quote the president in May about Syria, what do? We can get off the slippery slope. Little bit of lost face, a little bit of manhood or womanhood gone, but in the case of both President Clinton and President Reagan, boy, they came roaring back across the Middle East and elsewhere in the years ahead. So there are ways to do this, but they required taking risks, first of all. Just as we did, we armed all kinds of people in the 1980s, and we contributed to the rise of Al-Qaeda and the rise of Taliban. That's true, we brought down an empire. So if anybody wants us to do something about this, but says we can't have any risk, we're not going to do anything. That's how Washington works. Secondly, we can use military force. We might take casualties. We actually had a plane shot down in Libya. We've dealt with air defenses similar to Syria's in Iraq twice, in Libya. The Israelis deal with it. And we have all kinds of standoff weapons that can strike Syrian targets. The nature of a counterinsurgency is the way you defeat an insurgency, and the way they're defeating it, much of it is they're using air power and firepower and mobility. That requires electricity, that requires airfields, that requires ammo dumps, that requires fuel stocks, that requires refineries, and the highly industrial nature of war that supports that. Because you can't spread out, which is normal doctrine, because you got all these jihadists and suicide bombers and such, you have to concentrate just like we did in Iraq. And what you do is you provide a really good target for standoff precision weapons. This is exactly what Assad was afraid of in September. We might not have believed President Obama. President Obama might not have even believed that he had a good military plan. But Assad and his generals thought that we were able to inflict considerable damage. And it wasn't on tracking down this or that launcher that could launch or had launched a chemical weapon. They were, I'm sure, afraid that we would go after high-value targets that would make a difference in the war. That's what we need to do. We don't need troops on the ground. We're not going to transform this country like we tried in Afghanistan and Iraq. What we need to do is to have some diplomatic negotiating points to convince the Russians and indirectly, or maybe directly the Iranians, that they're not going to win, that we can drag this thing on, we can keep this thing going forever, as we did in Afghanistan, until they're willing to sit down and actually talk to us. Right now, as we've seen twice in the negotiations, they're not, because they think they're winning. If you do not change that calculus, they will continue to think they're winning, and eventually they're going to win. And that's the Middle East you're going to have. Thank you.
That was bracing. Let's continue with the Q&A for another couple of minutes before we go back to the panelists. Sir?
Thank you. My name is Noah Checkham, and I am from Jordan. My question is about ISIS. I've noticed recently, like in several news reports, that when the Assad regime, with their barrel bombing campaign, does not target Al-Qaeda-controlled areas or ISIS-controlled areas. And to me, it seems like about the time when we started to hear about ISIS, all of a sudden we no longer hear about Assad's militia, the Shabiha. So I'm starting to wonder, could it be the emergence of one body is related to the disappearance of another body in the news? Could it be the same beast in a different skin?
I'm not an expert on ISIS, but I think there's been a lot of reporting recently about the collusion, to some extent whether direct or indirect, between the Assad government and the Assad forces and some of the more radical elements of the rebellion, with the opposition making or trying to make the case that President Assad either feeds some of those groups or allows them to operate because it serves his purposes to have the more radical groups fight it out with the more moderate groups. And it also feeds his argument that he's the best option for the West, because if it's not him, it's the radical Al-Qaeda elements who would take over the country.
Thanks. Further questions? Sir.
Excuse me, Paul Van Son. I have a question. It's I've been struggling with on the chemical weapons issue at the present time. You know, the United States has an expensively equipped ship that's sitting off-road of Spain, waiting to hydrolyze these chemicals against them. The Danes have a ro-ro ship. The Norwegians have a ro-ro ship off Cyprus, each of which has a certain amount of chemicals, according to the press, or maybe 9% of what Assad has. We've got, and we're building now this multinational force of Chinese, Russians, Danes, British destroyers that are guarding these ships that are becoming like the Flying Dutchman, and they can't seem to put into any port once they take these chemicals aboard. This is a tremendous expense, and if you do some calculations, I think you'll figure out that those countries are probably spending in the neighborhood of $3 to $4 million a week to keep those ships afloat, all while we're waiting for Assad to bring the chemical weapons to the port to where they can be loaded. I'm not sure that I see any motivation for him to move those chemical weapons to the port anytime soon, and he could just take them a little at a time, because that allows him to continue to engage with the West, and his ambassadors talk at the OPCW, and people have to deal with him. On the other hand, if we seem to want to get engaged more with the opposition, or take a little stronger role against Assad, then it seems like that's not going to improve that situation as far as getting the chemical weapons out. It seems to me we're kind of between a rock and a hard place here. Getting the chemical weapons out, we're damned if we do, we damned if we don't, and I don't see any pressure other than the usual diplomatic pressure, which he can drag out forever. If anybody has any ideas, I'd appreciate hearing them on how to get the weapons out faster.
Well, strictly speaking, that's not a spillover. It's not a spillover question. But if any of the panelists wishes to comment, we'd welcome that.
At the time when the chemical deal was struck in September, there was a lot of talk about how this legitimized President Assad again in the eyes of the international community, because, as you rightly point out, it meant that he was the interlocutor again, and that's exactly where he wanted to be. And it's precisely why the Russians and the Iranians pushed him to make the deal. That does mean, as you say, that he doesn't have any incentive to rush delivering on the deal, because the longer it takes, the longer that it takes, it means that he is still needed as the interlocutor. It's an interesting question. You know, how do you make him speed up the implementation of the deal diplomatically? I'm not sure there is necessarily an answer to that. Do you have to take that into account when you make any decisions about military action? I mean, the U.S. seemed ready to strike when the chemical weapons were in the country. So, people like Jim and Steve May and you know, my co-panelists may know more about how you make those calculations when you decide to go for a military strike, if that is something that the U.S. administration decides to do. But in September, when the president announced that, or said that he might want to strike Syria, the chemical weapons were in the country, and they were certainly not planning to attack the stockpiles. They were going to attack airfields or command and control centers, and you'd assume that the risk that existed then still exists today, and as Jim pointed out, sometimes there are risks that you just have to take.
The spillover effect is if you strike the depot and the wind is blowing the wrong way, then you certainly don't want to be
But that risk
anywhere
was there
close.
before.
No, that's
Yeah, but I'm sorry, but I don't think there was ever a question of hitting the chemical weapon sites in September. I mean, they're going to hit the Assad regime in a way in which to make it pay, to force him to deliver. Nobody's going to hit the chemical weapon site. I mean, we're crazy. So the point is, I mean, to go back to your question, I mean, the only way to do it is if you can figure out a way of threatening Assad with another set of strikes and ask him in order to speed it up. That opens up the door for what Jim is talking in terms of more punitive actions, but
the concern is what the Assad government might do with the actual chemical weapons if they are suddenly under strike, which is a question that doesn't quite have an answer, I don't think.
This is a relevant question to spillover because I think in different directions we've all basically said it's not just spillover, it's a bigger question, and I'm a particular advocate of that. This is one of the few silver linings I've seen in the whole thing recently because one of my problems with the administration's position is as long as a few things are going right, well, okay, Hezbollah is rolling over half the country and Al-Qaeda is growing ever stronger in the other half of the country. But look, we're feeding a lot of refugees. We've got troops deployed with a kind of questionable mission in Jordan, and the chemical weapons is going right. We have an international coalition working to deal with this serious problem, to quote the Secretary of State. This is a historic achievement. And the more we see that the Syrians are just screwing us, and that the Syrians are not even giving us the fig leaf that on some little areas we can achieve something, and they did that in Geneva, and they're showing that to us, the more it demonstrates how impossible it's going to be in any rational, non-lethal, non-skin-in-the-game way to get anything out of this thing other than a total disaster. So it's a good thing. Because they're not going to use the chemical weapons again, that I believe, because then the president would have no choice but to bomb the hell out of them.
Okay, let's take two more questions before we move to the panel wrap-up, and I think we should just bundle the two questions. So, you in the back and you in the 4th row, give us your questions after identifying yourself, and then the relevant panelists will address themselves to those questions, and then we'll move to wrap-up.
Sure, thanks. Joyce Karam with Al Hayat newspaper. My question is actually on if you see this going down the road, a year or a year and a half from now, where do you see the impact on Hezbollah inside Lebanon? And then with Israel, I mean, if Hezbollah acquires sophisticated weapons from Syria, would we see Israel maybe targeting Lebanon? And where do you exactly see Russia's calculus in this? Because I myself do not understand anymore. I mean, will Al-Qaeda rise and Syria turn into another Lebanon? At what point will the Russians say this is really bad for us?
Hi, David Burkhart. Thank you. I was just wondering if someone could talk about the role of tribal networks outside of Syria in this spillover.
I'm going to suggest, since we've got about 10 minutes left, and I'm reluctant to run over, that the panelists in their wrap-ups, which we should begin now, try to address those questions in that context. I would just ask the panelists also to think about, if you're going to do so in your answers, whether the spillover effects that you've each described so well with respect to each of your countries is subject to intervention. In other words, can those problems that you've described so well be dealt with by intervention? And we've heard from Ambassador Jeffrey, I think, quite clearly that the answer is yes, there are interventionists things that can be done that would go a long way, in your view, towards the president's goal, as he expressed in the UN, of supporting allies at a minimum. But I'd like to hear the other panelists talk about that a little bit more specifically as well. Why don't we go in reverse order to the starting comments? So we'll start with Ben. But we've got, bear in mind, we've got about 8 minutes, so a couple of minutes, please.
I think, based on also on what your last question was, Steve, the one option that we didn't really flesh out a little bit was a more robust containment option, which is, containment is used by a lot of people to mean a lot of different things. And in some ways, the strategy, again, as Ambassador Jeffrey, I think, was just laying out, in some ways is sort of a containment-like strategy, but a more robust containment strategy would be more billions of dollars of assistance to these countries to be able to manage the refugee problems and other socioeconomic challenges. Potential military presence within their borders to take on the effects of, to defend themselves, to take on the effects of the radicalization. And then, the potential for the other option about more kinetic action against the extremists within Syria or those who are crossing between Syria and Iraq or Syria and elsewhere. And you can envision some form of package along those lines that unfortunately drags the situation out for several more months, if not years, while the conflict persists. But all that is to say that sort of, if Jordan, for example, is faced with an acute security threat by the Assad regime, you better believe that the United States would probably have its back in some form, and we could see more American troops on the ground in Jordan in some way under some Arab League or UN auspices or something. That would also lead to some kind of a more robust, I would call it a more robust containment or limitation strategy to some extent. The end state, of course, isn't clear for such an option, but it exists.
Yep.
I think that what we've seen over the last 3 years is actually an effort at containing the problem in Syria by arguing within the administration that it's not the US's problem, and that's why the US doesn't need to do that much about it beyond aid for the refugees or military support, financial support for its allies. But it's very clear that that's no longer tenable either. If you look at Lebanon, for example, the first 2 years of the Syrian revolution and the first 2 years of the Arab uprisings, the situation in Lebanon was fairly calm, and it was interesting to see that for once Lebanon was not the story in the Middle East. But the minute that Hezbollah decided that they had to cross the border and come to the rescue of President Assad, the spillover effect was there, and there is no going back anymore. I mean, Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, has made very clear that he and his party are going to continue to fight with President Assad. So there is simply no going back from there. I don't think you can contain that anymore within Syria, certainly not when it comes to the impact on Lebanon. I think that the long-term impact of the war in Syria on Lebanon needs to be kept in mind. I think that if the war at some point wraps up in Syria, I don't know when that will be, you risk seeing a continuation of the tension, the violence continue in Lebanon. And that's why I think it's so important to keep an eye on Lebanon, because it does feel marginal very often. It does feel like a small sideshow. But if Lebanon falls, if it tips over into full chaos, then the consequences for the region are also quite enormous, I would think. And that's why Lebanon does need the support of the international community. I had the president of the World Bank in September in an interview say that it was a mistake by the international community to take a bit of a hands-off approach when it came to Lebanon, because they didn't want to give too much aid because they were worried about Lebanon's complex politics, and he admitted that that was simply a mistake, because Lebanon cannot withstand the continued shocks of the war next door, and the burden that it places on the infrastructure of the country when you look at the number of refugees that it's having to deal with. When it comes to Hezbollah and their long-term prospects, I really think it depends on how the war plays out in Syria. They're very clearly feeling the pressure at the moment. That's why they agreed to this cabinet where they gave up a few key positions, like the Ministry of Defense, of Interior, of Justice, of Telecom. That's quite a substantial sacrifice. But in return, they are continuing, or in parallel, they're continuing to fight in Syria, because that is very important to them. And they will hold the cabinet accountable for the security situation in Lebanon. They'll hold the Lebanese cabinet accountable for the security situation in Lebanon. If bombings continue, they will use that to say that the cabinet has failed. Does that answer?
Yeah, it was good.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Henri, and then Jim, you've got the last word.
Okay, I mean, first of all, if we go back to the beginning of the crisis in Syria, everybody said, at least in the West, in Turkey, oh, Assad only has 6 months to survive, and then boom, he's going to disappear like everybody else disappeared in the region. And it's 3 years into that, he's survived. Why has he survived? Because I think the regime was probably ready for a Sunni uprising of some sort for a long time. Look, they've done Hama before, so they had experience. Secondly, Assad is fighting for his life. The Alawites are fighting for their lives. That's a perception. There's no reason, there's no incentive for them to change their behavior. And so if we were to bomb them, if we were to create so much havoc that we weaken them, first of all, today, who's going to win? It's going to be the jihadists, because that's the only other force. So we in fact, will become the air force for the jihadists. Now you can say, well, we should have intervened earlier, but earlier we thought that he was not going to survive, so why intervene then? So there is this dilemma. However, I would say, to go back to and the question about Russia. Russia, I think, has two very important incentives here. One is, it seems to think, rightly or wrongly, but this is what I've been told and heard, that containing the fighting in Syria, I mean, do you fight in Syria because you don't want to fight in Dagestan and Chechnya? For some reason, they think that the jihadists are going to take a 747 and go to Dagestan after winning in Syria. True, not true, but that's a perception. Second, they love sticking it to us. They love enjoying the position we find ourselves in, completely incapable of doing anything. We look weak, we look ham-fisted. So that's also their policy. There's no incentive at the moment for them to change. However, the country that has an incentive to change, and we may be seeing the beginning of a change, is Iran. Because look at from Iran's perspective, right? They're not just losing Syria, but they're losing Hezbollah and losing Iraq. Because if this project this conflict another year, another 2 years, it's going to engulf Iraq, it's going to engulf Lebanon, and so Iran's the only country that whose policies can be changed is Iran, but not the way Jim is suggesting, by attacking Assad. I mean, the Iranians have to come to the conclusion that Assad may be expendable, that something else can come into this, because after all, it's the Russians and the Iranians who are the linchpin when it comes to allowing Assad to survive. And more than the Russians, maybe it's the Iranians, because of the Hezbollah card, because of the overflights, the Shia card, and so on and so forth. So the focus should be Iran, and I think that's where we can see, maybe with Rouhani, and also the Iranians are not stupid. I mean, they see the situation develop on the ground and realize the consequences. That's what's up.
You cannot successfully contain this crisis by trying to deal with the symptoms from outside. Most specifically, not just Lebanon, but Iraq, it isn't going to work. It could hold on, either of them, by the various things we're doing and the people of Lebanon and the Arab world are doing, but it could very easily collapse into something far worse. Technically, you can contain both a jihadist threat and a kind of military threat of Assad and the Iranians on steroids against both Jordan and Turkey in a pure military sense, because of the ethnic, religious composition of those countries, and because we've got forces in both countries. They're both allies of ours. But that's not what I worry about with them. It's a question of what kind of allies are they going to be? What's their foreign policy going to be in 5 years if Assad and friends win most of the country and you have a huge jihadist threat in the rest of the country, and we've done little or nothing, and that's what the region thinks of us right now, is having done little or nothing. I don't think there's any doubt. If there's one thing that I'm sure of everything I've said today, the region thinks we've done little or nothing. In terms of now how to solve it, I've given you some views, but to talk about the diplomacy, Russia, it's key because it blocks UN resolutions, and UN resolutions are what this administration needs and the American people to take any kind of action, however unbold. And but the problem is, here you're absolutely right, except you almost portrayed Putin as sort of a mischievous, as the president said, kid at the back of the class. He's not a Slavic de Gaulle trying to make trouble for us. This guy is out to change the international order to his favor and to our unfavor. I honestly believe that, and I don't think everybody in the administration gets that. And until we get that, we're going to keep on seeing things, like in the paper last week, a senior administration official said, the Russians just don't understand they can't have it both ways. A happy Sochi and barrel bombs in Aleppo. Well, yes, they think so, and yes, they're doing it. And until that changes, they're going to continue doing this. Ditto Iran. My disagreement with you, Henri, is you're absolutely right. Iran is vulnerable, terribly vulnerable, and thus there's room for compromise, but only the day when it thinks that Assad might lose. Right now, that thought, as far as I can see, is not in the minds of any of the Iranian leaders. They think Assad and Hezbollah and their combo, supported by Russia, is winning, and I think objectively they're right. So therefore, they're not thinking that way. My goal is to get them to start thinking that they may be without Assad or something like Assad. Hezbollah might be isolated, and they're going to be a big loser. When you start making them think that way, then they will change.
Thanks, Jim. This was a terrific panel, and they've given us a huge amount to think about on a very complex subject. So I'd like to give them a hand. Thank you for coming to the IISS.